What could be so cruel about the SS Edmund Fitzgerald sinking that would cause Gordon Lightfoot to sing, "Does anyone know where the love of God goes when the waves turn the minutes to hours?" How bad could a storm really get on a lake? Welcome back, Bisons. This is a new series on my channel where I'm going to be talking about topics that I care passionately about. I wanted to start with the Edmund Fitzgerald because this November 10th is the 50th anniversary of the wreck itself, so I just wanted to talk about it and hopefully spread some awareness to anyone who didn't know about the event. We are going to be looking into the boat itself, its final voyage, possible causes for the sinking, its effects on the freighting industry, and how the wreck was immortalized through song. Unfortunately, I can't play any of the song in this video without getting copyrighted, but I will link it down below. I highly recommend listening to the song. It has a very good way of capturing the emotion of the wreck itself. So starting off just talking about the ship itself. The ship was an American Great Lakes freighter. It launched June 7th of 1958, and when it launched, it was the largest ship on the North American Great Lakes and remains the largest to have sunk. For 17 years, its industry was carrying taconite. This is a variety of iron-bearing sedimentary rock. Post-World War II, high-grade iron was mined to exhaustion in the US, so taconite became a more appealing option in order to still produce steel in the US. It is mined from the Mesabi Iron Range in Minnesota and transported to steel makers. The Fitzgerald carried it from mines near Duluth to the Great Lake ports like Detroit and Toledo. It set seasonal haul records 6 times and was known as a workhorse. It also was a popular ship for boat watchers. Captain Peter Pulser used to play music through the intercoms when they'd go through the St. Clair and Detroit rivers, and it connects, these rivers in particular are important because they connect Lake Huron to Lake Erie and the Sioux Locks, which connects Lake Superior to the rest of the Great Lakes, so it's a very frequent area for boat watchers to go. The boat itself was named after the president and chairman of Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company in Milwaukee. Great Lakes Engineering Works designed and constructed the ship within a foot of the max length allowed for passage to the soon-to-be-completed St. Lawrence Seaway. This seaway was completed in 1959, and it involved a system of rivers, locks, canals, and channels, permitting sea vessels to travel from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to Duluth, Minnesota. The rivers and locks that I just mentioned previously are part of that seaway. The ship itself was 730 feet long, 750 feet wide, and a 225-foot draft. It had 3 cargo holds loaded through 21 watertight cargo hatches. The ship itself had a bit of a controversial christening and launch ceremony that June 7th. Elizabeth Fitzgerald, who was the wife to Edmund Fitzgerald, tried to christen the ship by smashing a champagne bottle over the bow. Unfortunately, it took her 3 times to successfully break it. This is seen as a sign of bad luck. There was also a 36-minute delay before the launch happened, and the sideways launch was very iffy and caused a lot of water to splash about, and people who were there at the ceremony said that it seemed like the ship wanted to leap out of water. I do believe someone died of a heart attack also during the christening ceremony. I found one news article that mentioned it, but I wasn't able to find multiple sources. The ship's most common route was from Superior, Wisconsin, and Detroit, Michigan round trip. This took about 5 days, and the ship usually had 47 trips per season. By November of 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald had logged 748 round trips. In my intro, I did discount Lake Superior a little bit there, where I mentioned, how great can a storm get on a lake that would take a huge freighter down. For those of you who are not from the Great Lakes area or unfamiliar with the Great Lakes, I wanted to just share some things to help you comprehend the size of this lake, as well as the mystery and lore that's already surrounded Lake Superior itself. So there's 5 Great Lakes in total. Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake in the world by surface area. It has a surface area of 31,700 square miles. That's about the size of South Carolina or Austria. It has an average depth of 483 feet, with a maximum of 1,333 feet. It has enough water in the lake to cover the entire landmass of North and South America to a depth of 1 foot. So hopefully that helps people understand the sheer amount of water that is contained in Lake Superior. Another notable thing about the lake is how cold it is. Year-round, Lake Superior at around 660 feet is a constant 39 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 4 degrees Celsius. And this is what gives Lake Superior her most commonly known trait, and that is that Lake Superior never gives up her dead. And that is because no bacteria can survive at that temperature. So it's not able to bloat a body or start to decompose it, so it doesn't float to the surface. So most people who could go down with their ships remain with the ships, and it is very difficult to recover bodies from these wrecks. Before it was Lake Superior, the Ojibwe name for it was Kichigami. Another common thing to note about Lake Superior is the southern shore between Grand Marais, Michigan and Whitefish Point is known as the graveyard of the Great Lakes. This is where the Edmund Fitz had gone down, and there's more ships lost in this region than in any other area. If you go up to the UP along the Lake Superior coastline, there are shipwreck boat tours, since there are so many shipwrecks in that area. And since the water is so cold and the water is fresh, the ships tend to maintain better underwater. They don't experience as much deterioration. So it is popular for scuba divers and people like that to explore the watery depths of all of the ships. Another notorious boat that sank in Lake Superior is the SS Bannockburn, which sank on a snowy November evening in 1902. It was a steamship with a crew of 21, but the wreck and crew were never recovered. This is considered the Flying Dutchman of the Great Lakes. There are reports of people seeing this ship as a ghost ship with a skeleton crew, and they come out during storms on Lake Superior. Another common folklore for the lake is the Mishu Pishu, which is an Ojibwe word for the Great Lynx. It has many different names, as the Algonquin, Odawa, Shawnee, Crees, and Menominee tribes all have variations of this water panther. It calls Michopiacton Island in Lake Superior its home. It inhabits the deepest part of the lake and can inflict storms. These water monsters live in opposition to thunderbirds, which dominate the air. It is a dragon-lynx mix with the body of a lynx, horns of a deer, upright scales on its back, feathers, exceptionally long tails, and serpentine properties. It is believed that it is needed to be placated for safe passage across the lake, and it guards the vast amounts of copper in the lake. And if the tribes in the area wanted to mine copper, they could only mine it from the Mishu Pishu itself, either coming from its horns, hairs, or tail, but never without permission. And then just another fun fact about Mishu Pishu for those of you who live in Wisconsin. It is also known by the Potawatomi and Menominee tribes as the horned water spirit, and the Baraboo Hills in Wisconsin are said to have been created between a war between the water spirits and thunderbirds. I just wanted to include that because even before the shipping industry was taking over the lake, there was already a deep respect for the lake itself, and the nearby tribes had personified the November storms and the treacherous journey with the Mishu Pishu. I think it's cool to see how, as times change, we see things in different lights and have different explanations for why things happen. And I just wanted to share, I myself went to the graveyard of the Great Lakes to see the pictured rocks of Lake Superior, and I honestly didn't really believe that storms could just appear out of nowhere on Lake Superior. I've never lived on the lake, I've only been to it from time to time, but I went on a cruise to see the pictured rocks, and it was a perfectly sunny day. It was in July, it was 76 degrees, and halfway through the cruise, it was like a double-deck boat. A storm blew out of nowhere, and the waves had gotten so choppy, they were starting to go over the boat, and I was on the second level that was open to the sun, and we were just consistently getting drowned out from the water. And it was crazy because there was nothing predicted for the day. There was no storms, there was no rain, and by the time we made it back to the coastline, it was perfectly sunny again, and now I was just completely soaking wet and very cold. So it is true, the storms on Lake Superior develop out of nowhere. Now that we've established a respect for Lake Superior and have gotten to know a little bit about the Edmund Fitzgerald itself, I'd now like to explore the timeline of its final voyage. The timestamps I was able to find did differ from source to source, so I tried my best to make sure that each time was accurate, but there was some things that didn't have an exact time to them. So starting with 2:20 p.m. November 9th, 1975. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald left Superior, Wisconsin under the command of Captain Ernest M. McSorley. They were on their way to Detroit, Michigan with a cargo of 26,116 tons of taconite pellets, reaching a full speed of 14.2 knots. At 4:15 p.m., it was joined by a second freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, captained by Bernie Cooper. At this point in time, the National Weather Service predicted that a storm would pass south of Lake Superior by 7 a.m. November 10th. Because of this broadcast, both ships decided to take the regular Lake Carriers Association downbound route to their destination. And then just something fun to note is the SS Anderson is still in use today. You can track it using the ship radar. The last time I checked, it didn't have a location. I think it's going up for servicing very soon. At 7 p.m., the National Weather Service altered its forecast, issuing gale warnings for all of Lake Superior. Something to reach a gale wind, it is in the range of 34 to 47 knots. After this forecast, both ships altered their course northward, using Ontario's shore to shelter from the gale winds. 1 a.m. the next day on November 10th, both ships encounter the winter storm. The Edmund at this time is about 20 miles south of Isle Royale, and there are reported winds of 52 knots and waves of 10 feet. Around this time, Captain McSorley radioed the Anderson that he was slowing down. This report was overheard by Captain Piquet of Wilfred Sykes, who was actually surprised to hear that McSorley said this because he was famous for never reducing his speed, not even in bad weather. At 2 a.m., the National Weather Service upgrades its gale warning to storm winds of 35 to 50 knots. 3 a.m., the Edmund pulls ahead of the Anderson due to its higher speed. Also around this time, the wind speeds temporarily dropped as wind changed from northeast to south to northwest. After this, we jump ahead to 1:50 p.m. with the Anderson's weather report that they are experiencing winds of 50 knots. At 2:45 p.m., it began to snow, greatly reducing visibility. At this time, the SS Anderson lost visual sight of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which was 16 miles ahead. At 3:15 p.m., Captain Cooper reports that at this time, he saw the Fitzgerald pass far too close to the 6-fathom shoal to the north of Caribou Island, which is a dangerous area because of its shallow water. At 3:30 p.m., Captain McSorley radios the Anderson. Anderson, this is Fitzgerald. I have a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list. I'm checking down. Will you stay by me till I get to Whitefish? Cooper asked if McSorley had his pumps going, and McSorley said, yes, both of them. And then just to explain a little bit, if you're unfamiliar with ship terms about this, radio communications, the list that he's describing is the degree at which the vessel is leaning with no force acting on it, and this can cause a ship at a certain point to capsize and sink. So it's not a good sign. And him saying that he's checking down means that he is reducing his speed. He's doing so that the Anderson can catch up to him. Also at this time, the U.S. Coast Guard warns that the Soo locks are closed and that all ships should seek safe anchorage. And then at 4:10 p.m., Captain McSorley calls to report a radar failure and asks the Anderson to look after them. The radar failure is important because it makes the Edmund navigationally blind. They are already struggling because they are visually blind due to the snow and the increasing waves. At this point in time, the Fitzgerald slowed to keep a 10-mile range for radar guidance from the Anderson, and the Anderson started guiding them to Whitefish Bay. And as the Anderson was watching them, they would lose the Edmund Fitzgerald on radar every single time a wave would crest high enough to block their radar of the Edmund. At 4:39 p.m., Captain McSorley contacted the U.S. Coast Guard in Grand Marais, Michigan, to ask if the Whitefish Point light and navigational beacon were operational. These were both reported to be inactive, so at this time, Captain McSorley can't even rely on the navigational aids from land. At 4:52 p.m., the Anderson logged winds as high as 58 knots with waves as high as 25 feet. The wind was gusting 70 to 75 knots, and they were experiencing rogue waves as high as 35 feet. Captain Cooper would later report that during this weather, up to 12 feet of water were accumulating on his deck at times because of the waves crashing over. And then between 5 to 5:30 p.m., Captain McSorley asked any ships at Whitefish Point to report the state of navigational aids. Captain Cedric Woodward of Avafors, which was a saltwater vessel, reported the Whitefish Point light was on, but not the radio beacon. And then this is the radio transmission between Avafors and the Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald, this is the Avafors. I have the Whitefish light now, but I'm still receiving no beacon. Over. I'm very glad to hear it. The wind is really howling down here. What are the conditions where you are? Then there are undiscernible shouts heard by the Avafors and someone shouting, don't let nobody on deck. What's that, Fitzgerald? Unclear. Over. I have a bad list, lost both radars, and am taking heavy seas over the deck. One of the worst seas I've ever been in. If I'm correct, you have 2 radars. They're both gone. 6:55 p.m., the men in the Anderson's pilot house felt a bump, felt the ship lurch, and then turned to see a monstrous wave engulfing their entire vessel from astern. The wave drove the bow down into the sea. The ship was able to shake off that wave just for a second wave even bigger to hit, and then both of those waves headed towards the Edmund Fitzgerald. The first mate of the Anderson wanted to make sure that they were okay, so at 7:10 p.m., the first mate radios the Fitzgerald while watching them on radar. Fitzgerald, this is the Anderson. Have you checked down? Yes, we have. Fitzgerald, we are about 10 miles behind you and gaining about 1.5 miles per hour. Fitz, there is a target 19 miles ahead of us, so the target would be 9 miles ahead of you. Well, am I going to clear? Yes, he's going to pass to the west of you. Well, fine. By the way, Fitzgerald, how are you making out with your problems? We are holding our own. Okay, fine, I'll be talking to you later. The radar signal was already being continuously lost from the waves, and around 7:15 p.m., the radar blip was lost again, but this time it never returned. And this was especially weird because no distress signal ever came from the Fitzgerald, and the last words to ever be heard from anyone on the crew was, "We are holding our own." At 7:22 p.m., the first mate tried calling the Fitz, but there was no answer. Captain Cooper later reports that he was very concerned because he could not see the lights where he should have been able to, and verified with the William Clay Ford that his phone was in fact putting out a good signal. He asked around to see if the ship had sheltered at Whitefish Point, but no one had seen it, and at the time the Coast Guard was busy looking for a 16-foot boat that was overdue. At 7:39 p.m., Captain Cooper called the U.S. Coast Guard in Sault Ste. Marie on the radio distress frequency. The Coast Guard requested them to switch to Channel 12 to keep the emergency line open, and they were also experiencing communication issues as they had antennas been blown down by the storm. Both at 7:54 p.m. and 8:25 p.m., Cooper repeatedly expressed his concern about the Fitzgerald to the U.S. Coast Guard. At 9:03 p.m., the Fitzgerald was officially reported missing. Around 9 p.m., the Anderson had made its way to Whitefish Point, and the U.S. Coast Guard asked the Anderson to turn around and look for survivors as they lacked emergency vessels. This is their radio transmission. Anderson, this is Group Sioux. What is your present position? We're down here about 2 miles off Parison Island right now. The wind is northwest 40 to 45 miles here in the bay. Is it calming down at all, do you think? In the bay it is, but I heard a couple of salties talking up there and they wish they hadn't gone out. Do you think there's any possibility and you could come about and go back there and do any searching? Oh God, I don't know. That sea out there is tremendously large. If you want me to, I can. But I'm not going to be making any time. I'll be lucky to make 2 or 3 miles an hour going back out that way. Well, you'll have to make a decision as to whether you'll be hazarding your vessel or not, but you're probably one of the only vessels right now that can get to the scene. We're going to try to contact those saltwater vessels and see if they can't possibly come about and possibly come back also. Things look pretty bad right now. It looks like she may have split apart at the seams like the Morale did a few years back. Well, that's what I've been thinking. But we were talking to him about 7, and he said that everything was going fine. He said that he was going along like an old shoe, no problems at all. Well, do you think you could come about and go back and have a look in the area? Well, I'll go back and take a look, but God, I'm afraid I'm going to take a hell of a beating out there. I'll turn around and give her a whirl, but God, I don't know, I'll give it a try. That would be good. Do you realize what the conditions are out there? At this time, there was no reply from the Coast Guard, so Cooper tries again. Affirmative. From what your reports are, I can appreciate the conditions. Again, though I have to leave that decision up to you as to whether it would be hazarding your vessel or not if you think you can safely go back to that area. I would request that you do so, but I have to leave the decision up to you. I can give it a try, but that's all I can do. And I just wanted to commemorate the SS Anderson and its crew for, I can't even imagine what it would be like weathering the storm that took out a huge freighter like the SS Edmund Fitzgerald and being the only people who could go back out into that storm to try and rescue people after you finally made it to the safety of the bay. And at 10:30 p.m., the U.S. Coast Guard asked all commercial vessels in Whitefish Bay to assist in the search. The SS William Clay Ford joined the rescue effort. The SS Hilda Marianne was foiled by the weather, and the U.S. Coast Guard sent a buoy tender from Duluth, but it took 2.5 hours to launch and a day to get to the search area. At 10:53 p.m., the U.S. Coast Guard launched an HU-16 amphibious flying boat to search. At 1 a.m., an HH-52 Sea Guard, which is an amphibious helicopter, arrived with 3.8 million candle-powered searchlight. A Canadian Coast Guard aircraft joined, as well as the Ontario Police maintained a beach patrol along the Lake Superior coast. The search recovered debris, lifeboats, and rafts, but none of the crew. All 29 of the crew members perished with the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The crew consisted of the captain, the first, second, and third mates, 5 engineers, 3 oilers, cook, wiper, 2 maintenance men, 3 watchmen, 3 deckhands, 3 wheelsmen, 2 porters, a cadet, and a steward. Most were from Ohio and Wisconsin. I also was able to find a website that has each of the crew members listed with just some information about them. So if you're curious about getting to know a little bit more about them and their story, I will link that in the description below. The wreck itself wasn't discovered until November 14th, 1975. It was discovered by a U.S. Navy Lockheed P-3 Orion aircraft piloted by Lieutenant George Connor using its magnetic anomaly detector. The location was 15 miles west of Deadman's Cove, Ontario, and 17 miles southeast from the entrance to Whitefish Bay. There were later a series of underwater surveys that were done and dives to learn more about the wreck. The underwater surveys found that the Fitzgerald was in 2 large pieces, in 530 feet of water. The bow was at a length of 276 feet, and the stern was at a length of 253 feet. The bow stood upright in the mud 170 feet from the stern at a 50-degree angle, and in the middle were taconite pellets and scattered hatch covers and hull plating. In a 1989 dive, it was found that there was still glass intact on the ship, and there was a door on the pilot house that had been opened, leading people to believe that someone had tried to escape through there. They also found extensive damage on the bow that could not have been caused by the storm. In a 1994 dive, the remains of a crew member, partly dressed in coveralls and wearing a life jacket, was found alongside the bow of the ship. The life jacket could indicate that the crew was potentially aware of a risk of sinking, which personally, if I was on a ship during a storm like that, I would just have my life jacket on the whole time, regardless of if I thought we were going down. 1995 dive was a special dive that was funded by the Chippewas Sioux tribe to retrieve the bell from the ship and put a beer can in the pilot house. The bell is now located in the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, although now the location of the wreck is a historical site and you need a permit from Canada in order to dive in the area, but it's mostly considered to be a watery grave. The families of the crew members whose lives were lost specifically requested that people stop disturbing the wreck site. The next section is where a lot of the drama around the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald is, and that is what caused the Edmund Fitzgerald to sink specifically. But since none of the crew survived the incident, we don't have an official understanding of what happened. Well, I guess there are official reports, but we don't truly know what happened. So I'm going to go through some of the popular theories as to what people think happened. All of these theories are going to include that the extreme weather and sea were playing a role as well as what is being listed. So I'll start with the first theory, which is just waves and weather. I know, very, very creative. So in 2005, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration and the National Weather Service ran a computer simulation including the weather and wave conditions covering the period of November 9th, 1975 until the early morning of November 11th. They wanted to recreate what truly happened that night weather-wise just to see what those conditions would create. They found 2 separate areas on Lake Superior that had high wind speeds at 4 p.m. on November 10th. In one of the areas, they had wind speeds in excess of 43 knots, and in the other, wind speeds in excess of 40 knots. The southeastern part of the lake in which the Edmund Fitzgerald was traveling had the highest winds. The average wave height increased to near 19 feet by 7 p.m. on November 10th, and winds exceeded 50 miles per hour over most of southeastern Lake Superior. Where the Fitzgerald sank was at the eastern edge of this area of high wind, where there was a long fetch, which is the distance that wind blows over water, that was producing significant waves averaging over 23 feet by 7 p.m. and over 25 feet by 8 p.m. The simulation also showed that 1 in 100 waves reached 36 feet and 1 out of every 1,000 waves reached 46 feet. And the maximum sustained winds in this area reached near hurricane force of 70 miles per hour gusts to 86 miles per hour at the time and location where the Fitzgerald sank. So that theory is basically just, it was really windy, the waves were really big, so the ship sank. But I do think and we got important information from running the simulation. I think that does help add some more perspective as to what was going on. The next theory is the rogue wave theory. So, as we mentioned in the timeline of the sinking, there was a report of 3 rogue waves, often called the Three Sisters, that were reported in the vicinity of the Edmund Fitzgerald at the time that it sank. This Three Sisters phenomenon is something that has been reported previously happening on Lake Superior, and it is a sequence of 3 rogue waves forming that are 1/3 larger than normal waves. And these are extremely damaging because the first wave introduces an abnormal, large amount of water onto the deck of the ship, and then that water is not able to fully drain away before the second wave strikes, adding to the amount of water on deck. And then by the time the third wave hits, you've again had multiple accumulated sections of water, and you start overloading the deck with too much water. If we think back, Captain Cooper of the Anderson reported that his ship was hit by 2 30 to 35 foot seas about 6:30 p.m. One buried the aft cabins, damaging a lifeboat by pushing it down. The second wave of this size, perhaps 35 foot, came over the bridge deck. And then Cooper said that these 2 waves, possibly followed by a third, continued in the direction of the Edmund Fitzgerald and would have struck about the time she sank. At the time these waves would have hit the Fitzgerald, the ship already had a known list and was going much lower speeds in heavy seas, meaning that the ship was already retaining much more water on deck than usual. So we already know there was a lot of water on this boat before the 3 waves hit. Now, you might think this sounds pretty reasonable, like we have witness accounts of these waves and then they went towards the Fitzgerald at the time she sank. This doesn't seem like a crazy theory, but the problem is, in 1975, rogue waves were considered mythical and lacked hard evidence. Now, rogue waves are proven to exist and is a known natural phenomenon, but at the time, it would just be kind of a sailor's tale of, oh yeah, this one really big wave, and they didn't have any hard evidence, so it was kind of dismissed as something that would happen. The first scientific evidence of their existence came from the recording of a rogue wave by Gorham platform in the central North Sea in 1984. The wave was detected at a height of 36 feet in a relatively low sea state, but things didn't start getting serious until there was a digital measurement of a rogue wave at the Dropner platform in the North Sea on January 1st, 1995, called the Dropner wave. It had recorded a maximum wave height of 84 feet and peak elevation of 61 feet. During that event, minor damage was inflicted on the platform far above sea level, confirming the accuracy of the wave height reading made by the downwards pointing laser sensor. In 1975, the rogue wave theory didn't catch a lot of traction. Now that we know they do exist, we have evidence of it. Captain Cooper reports having seen a rogue wave. I don't think the rogue wave theory is that crazy. Next is a very controversial theory, and this is the cargo hold flooding theory. On July 26, 1977, the U.S. Coast Guard Marine Casualty Report suggested that the accident was caused by ineffective hatch closures. The report said that these devices failed to prevent waves from inundating the cargo holds. The flooding occurred gradually and probably wasn't even noticeable throughout the final day, resulting in a fatal loss of buoyancy and stability. As a result, the Edmund Fitzgerald plummeted to the bottom without warning. When there was dives down to the ship, there was video footage of the wreck site showing that most of the hatch clamps were in perfect condition. The U.S. Coast Guard said that there was only a few damaged clamps, and those were probably the only ones that were fastened. So as a result, ineffective hatch closure caused the Fitzgerald to flood and founder. But the issue is with the U.S. Coast Guard saying officially it's the hatches, that places the blame on the crew for not closing all of the hatches, and the families of the crew members were very upset by this because it felt like the U.S. Coast Guard was just trying to avoid accountability and just be like, well, we don't need to change anything because, people didn't do their job, so it's not our fault. And this is especially fishy because they were currently being questioned about their own preparedness as well as licensing and rule changes. So they were on some hot coals themselves. So that's why this theory isn't well liked by a lot of people. And honestly, it is suspicious that the U.S. Coast Guard didn't think that anything else could have caused it. I also agree that I think it's just an attempt to avoid accountability. The next theory is shoaling. This is the one that the Lake Carriers Association backed as a theory. They didn't like the hatch cover leakage. They thought it was more likely that the Fitzgerald had grounded on the 6-fathom shoal northwest of Caribou Island when the vessel unknowingly raked a reef during the time the Whitefish Point light and radio beacon were not available as navigational aids. This hypothesis was supported by 1976 by the Canadian Hydrographic Survey, which disclosed that an unknown shoal ran a mile farther east of the 6-fathom shoal than known on the Canadian charts. So if you were looking at a map, you wouldn't know that this shoal existed on the waters unless someone had told you. And there were crew members on the Anderson that observed that the Fitzgerald sailed to this exact area. And then something that Captain Cooper mentioned is that the Fitzgerald reported having a downed fence rail, and for this to happen to a ship, the ship needs to hog. And by that I mean, instead of sagging, it's hogging. And you'd hog because the hull would hit a shoal, the bow and stern would be bent downward, and the midsection would be raised by the shoal, and that would pull the railing tight until the cables dislodged or tore under the strain. It is something to note, the damage that the Fitzgerald was sustaining can give us clues as to what was happening, and I do agree that I think the fence railing could only have gone down if the ship was hogging. This was countered a little bit by divers searching the 6-fathom shoal after the wreck, that they said they found no evidence of a recent collision or grounding anywhere. And then photography taken of the overturned stern showed that there was no evidence on the bottom of the stern or the propeller or the rudder of the ship that would indicate the ship struck a shoal. Although there's also something to note about this theory that was brought up by Captain Paquette of the Wilfred Sykes that argued that the Lake Carriers Association supporting the shoaling explanation represents the shipping company's interest by advocating a hypothesis that held LCA member companies, the American Bureau of Shipping, and the U.S. Coast Guard Service blameless. So this is another theory that puts the blame off of the big guys in the situation, and that's always fishy. And then this is crazy. Okay, the last theory we're going to bring up is structural failure. So this claims that there was already a weakened structure and modification of the Fitzgerald's winter load line. This allowed heavier loading and had the ship travel lower in the water, making it possible for large waves to cause a stress fracture in the hull. The U.S. Coast Guard's formal casualty report concluded that she had separated upon hitting the lake floor. So the Coast Guard saying the ship hit the bottom and then split up. And then the National Transportation Safety Board came to the same conclusion. Most people think that it's more likely that the ship broke in two on the surface before sinking due to the intense waves that were happening. The extent of the taconite coverage over the wreck site showed that the stern had floated on the surface for a short time and spilled taconite into the forward section, so the two sections of the wreck did not sink at the same time. In the 1994 dive, the team found that the stern and bow were 255 feet apart, which would make more sense for them to be that separated if they sank separately in two different pieces. A former second mate, Richard Orgel, who served on the Edmund Fitzgerald in 1972 and 73, testified that the ship had a tendency to bend and spring during storms, like a diving board after someone has jumped off. And George H. Bergner, from the Edmund Fitzgerald steward for 10 seasons and winter ship keeper for 7 years, testified in a disposition that a loose keel contributed to the vessel's loss. He testified that the keel and the sister celsons were only tack welded, and that he had personally observed that many of the welds were broken. So for any of you non-welders, instead of being welded in a straight line, there was welded in chunks, and also keels are usually riveted, which allows for more movement in the material, whereas the welds restrict the movement of the material. And when Bethlehem Steel Corporation permanently laid up the Edmund Fitzgerald's sister ship, SS Arthur B. Halmer, just 5 years after going to considerable expense to lengthen her, questions were raised as to whether both ships had the same structural problems. The two vessels were built in the same shipyard using welded joints instead of riveted joints, and like I said before, these riveted joints allow the ships to flex and work in heavy seas, while the welded joints are more likely to break. Reports indicate that repairs to the Edmund Fitzgerald's hull were delayed in 1975 due to plans to lengthen the ship during the winter layup. So basically, like, we're going to modify the hull anyways, let's skip maintenance because it's not going to matter. The Arthur B. Homer was lengthened to 825 feet and placed back in service by December 1975, not long after the Fitzgerald foundered. In 1978, without explanation, the Bethlehem Steel Corporation denied permission for the chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board to travel on the Arthur B. Homer, and then the Homer was permanently laid up in 1980 and broken for scrap in 1987. Just some things to know about the Bethlehem Steel Corporation is, if any of you are from the Chicago area, this company made this steel for the Merchandise Mart in Chicago. And also something to know about this company is in the 1970s, the company was already struggling due to pension layouts and smaller mills and overseas steel becoming cheaper, so they were losing business. So in my mind, if the steel company is struggling and they're trying to lengthen ships and just keep loading them up with as much taconite as possible, it feels like more desperate calls might have been made in the case for money purposes. A retired naval architect, Raymond Ramsey, was one of the members of the design team that worked on the hull of the Fitz, reviewed the increased load lines, maintenance history, and the history of longship hull failure, and said that the Fitz was not seaworthy on November 10th, 1975. The long ship design was implemented without any research or development being done before the implementation, and lengthening the ship to 729 feet caused multi-axial bending and springing of the hull. And that is everything for the theories, so you might wonder, Bison Lover, what is your theory? First of all, we need to acknowledge the hull was in shambles. We also need to recognize that rogue waves were spotted heading towards the Fitzgerald. Also, the Fitzgerald was potentially over shoal. I think that, it was already listing. I think getting hit by the 3 rogue waves is what finally caused the hull to just give up. It seems to me that this ship had been falling apart on the seams the whole time it was weathering this storm. Although I would like to hear your guys' opinions, so feel free to tell me your favorite theory or what you think might have caused the sinking based off of what we know. I would love to hear everybody's opinions. So next up, we're just going to be discussing some contributing factors to the wreck. We have the theories, which kind of have these overarching ideas of what might have happened, but there are a lot of small things that all built up to the wreck itself that I think are important to acknowledge and think about, starting with the first error, which was the weather forecasting. The National Weather Service original forecast was that the storm was going to pass south of Lake Superior. Captain Paquette of Wilfred Sykes had been charting this low pressure system since November 8th and predicted it would track across eastern Lake Superior, and because of that, he chose a route that offered the most protection and sheltered in Thunder Bay during the worst of the storm. Paquette kind of uses this as an example that maybe the captains of the ship should be better at predicting weather patterns, but I don't think it's that crazy to trust the National Weather Service. I know they're wrong all of the time, but I don't think it's crazy to trust their forecasts and not chart their own, but I could be alone. The Anderson and the Fitzgerald chose the route that they took based off of National Weather Service forecasts, leading them directly into the storm. In a 2005 study using the meteorological data, they said that it ended up in precisely the wrong place at the absolute worst time. Another issue we had was incorrect navigational charts. The U.S. Coast Guard examined navigational charts after hearing reports of the shoals extending farther than previously recorded. They conducted a survey and found that shoal ran about 1 mile farther east than shown on Canadian charts. And based off of what Captain Cooper was talking about, this was kind of known to have existed for years, but the charts had never been updated with this information. There was also a lack of watertight bulkheads. Without these, there's no watertight integrity. A 1-inch hole could cause a ship to sink without these, because there's basically nothing left to help promote buoyancy. And unfortunately, Great Lakes ore carriers were built valuing efficiency instead of human life aboard the ship. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation concluded that Great Lakes freighters need to be constructed with watertight bulkheads in their cargo holds. It does not seem to me to be good ship design for any size of hole to cause a ship to sink, especially a ship the size of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And there was a lack of instrumentation. The Fitzgerald did not have a fathometer. It's instead had a hand line, which was just a line with knots in at measured intervals with a weight on the bottom, and you would just count the knots as it went down. Very official. I mean, technically not dependent on technology, but unfortunately it's very difficult to use that when you're in the middle of a storm. And if they had a fathom meter, they could have used this as a navigational aid during the storm. And at this time, it was not required by U.S. Coast Guard regulations. The Fitzgerald had no way of monitoring the amount of water in the cargo hold. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation found that it would have been impossible to pump water from the hold when it was filled with bulk cargo, and he had no way to determine whether the vessel had lost freeboard and would be taking on more water than could be handled. To me, this seems like something you need to know. And not only were we already losing freeboard from taking in water, Edmund Fitzgerald had increased load lines and reduced freeboard. So U.S. Coast Guard increased load lines in 1969, 71, and 73 to allow 3 feet and 3.25 inches less minimum freeboard than the original design in 1958. This means that the deck of the ship was only 11.5 feet above the water when it was getting hit by 35-foot waves. But don't worry, because this load line allowed them to carry 4,000 more tons than it was designed to even carry. At least we're getting more taconite to Toledo. This also decreased the vessel's critical reserve buoyancy, and because of this increased weight, the ship now had a slower response and recovery times. So keeping in mind this slower response and recovery times, the Edmund Fitzgerald ran aground in 1969 and collided with the SS Hochelaga in 1970, as well as striking the wall of a lock in the same year. It also hit the wall of a lock in 73 and 74. The National Transportation Safety Board investigators note that these accidents could have caused undetected damage that led to structural failure, and these ships at the time were only getting dry locked for inspection once every 5 years, and the hull was being held together with patching plates. The next up is something that I think is prevalent in all great tragedies, and that is complacency. The U.S. Coast Guard didn't broadcast for ships to seek safe anchorage until after 3:35 p.m., which was many hours after the gale warnings were upgraded to a storm. Also, shipping companies pressured their captains to deliver cargo as quickly and cheaply as possible, regardless of bad weather. This is the quote from the U.S. Coast Guard. "The nature of Great Lakes shipping, with short voyages, much of the time in very protected waters, frequently with the same routine from trip to trip, leads to complacency and an overly optimistic attitude concerning the extreme weather conditions that can and do exist. The Marine Board feels that this attitude reflects itself at times in deferral of maintenance and repairs, and failure to prepare properly for heavy weather, and in the conviction that since refugees are near, safety is possible by running for it. While it is true that sailing conditions are good during the summer season, changes can occur abruptly with severe storms and extreme weather and sea conditions arising rapidly. This tragic accident points out the need for all persons involved in Great Lakes shipping to foster increased awarenesses of the hazards which exist." This quote was countered by people pointing out that this places the blame on an industry-wide complacency and ignores that the U.S. Coast Guard had inspected the Edmund Fitzgerald just 2 weeks before it sank. Interesting. This incident also exposed the lack of rescue capability by the U.S. Coast Guard. I still can't believe they just sent out the Anderson back out there for the Fitzgerald. I understand somebody needed to go and look, but that ship had just survived those waters, and the U.S. Coast Guard was like, you have to go back out there. And it was also explained that there were severe budget cuts that were limiting their ability to maintain their rescue systems. So all of these things compiled together also contributed to what might have caused the Fitzgerald to sink. After the investigations from the U.S. Coast Guard and the National Transportation Safety Board, there was 8 actions and regulations that were put in place. The first one is requirements for vessels of 1,600 gross register tons and over have to use depth finders. And number 2, survival suits are required to be in crew members' cabins and workstations. These survival suits are a waterproof dry suit that protect people from hypothermia, a Lauren -C position system for navigation on the Great Lakes was implemented in 1980. This was later upgraded to the GPS system in the 1990s. Emergency position indicating radio beacons were installed on Great Lake vessels for accurate location for search and rescue. The northeastern Lake Superior navigational charts were redone for accuracy. The National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration developed a new method for predicting wave heights. The U.S. Coast Guard rescinded their 1973 load line regulation amendment that permitted reduced freeboard loadings, and the U.S. Coast Guard began annual pre-November inspections to check hatch and vent closures and life-saving equipment. Because of all of these amendments that were changed and taken place, and because of the public outrage of the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, it has been noted that in the 50 years following the Fitzgerald sinking, there has not been a single major commercial shipwreck on the Great Lakes. In comparison, from 1875 to 1975, there had been 6,000 wrecks. There was also a cultural shift here where people were outraged by companies not taking responsibility for their actions, and culturally people wanted these companies to prioritize crew safety and invest in better technology, and they stopped assuming that the lakes were safer than the ocean. In order to honor those who lost their lives in the sinking, there are different memorial services around the Great Lakes region. The most infamous one is the Mariners Church in Detroit holds an annual memorial reading the names of the crewmen and ringing the church bell 29 times. The Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point also has a memorial to the Edmund Fitzgerald and has their bell on display. The Split Rock Lighthouse in Minnesota emits a light every November 10th in honor of the Fitzgeralds. And then the most famous memorial of all is Ontario singer-songwriter Gordon Lightfoot writing, composing, and recording The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald in 1976. Because of this song, it made the sinking one of the best known disasters in all of Great Lakes shipping. In the book The Gales of November by John Bacon, he explains that Lightfoot began composing the song the night the ship went down, unaware that there was even a ship sinking. He was a seasoned sailor and had witnessed the storm from Toronto and knew that it was going to be a very bad time on Lake Superior. He later wrote the lyrics to the tune he was writing after he read the article The Cruelest Month. He had noticed that they had misspelled the Edmund Fitzgerald and was frustrated by the inaccuracies and the disrespect that was causing. During the recording of the song, Lightfoot began by playing the opening chords and singing. He waited over a minute before he signaled for the drummer to come in. This happens at 1 minute 34. He said later that this represented the thunder coming in from the storm, and the recording of the song was the first time anybody had played it. So what you hear on the radio is its first take. This song was well respected by the families who were affected, as Lightfoot knew the families and kept in touch and would show up to different services that they had held. And the Mariners Church, the one that rings the bell 29 times, after the death of Gordon Lightfoot in 2023, the church rang the bell an additional time in honor for everything he did. And I just wanted to share some of the most impactful lyrics from the song that have always stayed with me. The lake, it is said, never gives up her dead when the skies of November turn gloomy. Here we're explaining how Lake Superior is so cold that bodies are never floating to the surface, but rather stay down with the ship, with the reminder that November is infamous for storms on the lake. The searchers all say they'd have made Whitefish Bay if they put 15 more miles behind her. This shows the pain of being in the proximity of safety but not making it. It still wasn't enough. At 7 p.m., a main hatchway caved in. He said, "Fellas, it's been good to know ya." Although no one knows what happens in the ship's final moments, this verse humanizes the feelings that were experienced moments before the end, knowing it was too late. And quite possibly the most famous line of all, "Does anyone know where the love of God goes when the waves turn the minutes to hours?" This perfectly represents the grief and despair of this tragedy and makes us question things when our lives are threatened and how pain can make time pass slowly. I highly encourage everyone to go listen to the song in full. It is very beautifully written. There's a reason it made the wreck so famous. I wish I could play it here, but I don't want my channel to get taken down. That is my report of the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald 50 years post. I hope you guys were able to learn some things. I'm sorry for my pronunciations. I did my best to look everything up, but I did learn all of the information through reading, so some things were lost in translation there. I am from the Lake Michigan side of the Great Lakes, not the Lake Superior side, so I apologize. I'm less familiar with the locations in that area. But also, if I got anything wrong or if something seems a little bit off, feel free to comment and we can discuss below if I found something incorrectly. There was quite a bit of differing information online, so I tried my best to just only go off of more reasonable resources. If you want to look into things more, the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum website has a lot of good information about the Fitzgerald. That's where I was able to get the radio transmissions between the different ships. With all that being said, thank you so much for watching. If you don't mind, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I hope to see you guys in the next one.